I mean, in the years where we didn't necessarily have that internal leadership, I'd always ask myself, like, what can I do differently or better to help them learn to lead, right? So I mean, I took that on my own shoulders, but I think it was both. I think that they were some special young women who stepped up and did that, along with, having like a packet of standards that the team comes up with and agrees on.
You are listening to the Bridging Impact Podcast, transforming leaders on and off the court with host, Coach Furtado. Without further ado, let's dive in. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. I'm thrilled for our conversation today with Becky Beaulieu. She is the founder of Championship Culture Coach, which means she is a championship culture coach. Her program, when you implement, or the teams that have implemented at least 3 of the strategies, they have seen a 61% increase in the winning percentage. Who doesn't love winning? In the following 5 games. And then after year 2, 23% increase winning percentage. That's amazing. I'm excited to have that feeling of positive culture in the air and synergy. It's a big thing that I believe in when I coach. So welcome to the show, Becky.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks for having me, Justin.
All right, let's dive right into it. I know that multiple sports were an important part of your life. I know that you've coached gymnastics. So let's take it all the way back and just kind of have sports as a broad view. We're all about, bridging impact and talking about the impact that sports have on our lives. But, for you and in your life, how has sports, and the multiple sports that you played growing up made an impact on you?
Yeah, I started when I was like 2 years old in diapers doing, mom and taught gymnastics class, but played soccer actually competitively all the way through high school and then just gymnastics in college, but also dabbled in softball and track. But how has sport impacted my life? I mean, I think it's really shaped my identity and all of my friendships. It's become my life's work, and I'm just happy to. I would say serving too, I think, is a big part of me and who I am. And so I'm just happy to serve more teams and give back to sport in really a new and profound way.
Yeah, and serving is such a great aspect to leadership, and it's such a great opportunity to learn about how to serve your teammates when you're an athlete. Can you share any stories or any times that you remember of, like, if you look back, you're like, I was serving my teammates at this point in time, and maybe even as an athlete, you weren't sure that you were serving?
That's a good question. And I was fortunate enough to be on 2 national championship gymnastics teams at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, and then got to be an assistant coach under 2 more. But serving then, yeah, I think it was just like really getting to know every athlete and love them. And I just flew out and worked with a team in upstate New York last week, but we really talked about, for the upperclassmen, it's not about judging them. It's about knowing them and loving them and communicating with them. So I think that's serving.
I love that. And I think, kind of diving right into the work that you're doing right now, you have a minute by minute, consulting program. And so that means I'm sure you're watching what some of these teams and how they practice. And I'm just curious, when you see a team that knows their athletes, what does that look like? What does it sound like? What does it feel like? What's the energy in the room?
Yeah. And you know what? You can walk into the room and you can feel it in the air, is how I would describe it. And there's just this whole nother level of chemistry about them. So, an example is, our gymnastics team last year that I had coached. It was the week of St. Patrick's Day, and they're all dressed in green, and I walk into the gym and they're all doing Just Dance. And you can just really feel that synergy in the air. I can tell you what it doesn't look like is, designated cliques sitting here, here, and here, right? And I think who they warm up next to and stretch next to and sit next to on the bus, it all matters.
Okay, so let's go back, right? That's kind of the feeling we want to cultivate as coaches. And I think the easier part from my short experience being a coach these last couple of years, the easiest part is the X's and O's. And not that X's and O's are easy. It's just, it's you don't have to deal with the emotions of it. You just put players in, and I'm not sure what the X's and O's look like for gymnastics, but for basketball, right? You put the player on the wing or on the block, and they're like, hey, just have at it, right? This is what you do. This is the play, right? That's kind of the simple aspect, in my opinion. And what the real magic is, and I'm curious, when we're starting foundational blocks, how do we really cultivate that, chemistry, that feeling in the air when we walk into a room?
Yeah, and it's difficult, right? So only 11% of teams really have that like championship culture, which means the other 89% of teams are striving to get there or don't know what that is. But how do we do it? It starts with having a clear vision and values, and is the staff and the systems within a team, are they aligned? What are the standards of behavior? What does it look like? And not what's on the wall, but when you walk in, how do they train? How do they communicate? Is there a really high standard of behavior? And
I mean,
those championship teams too, what's different about them is they're on a mission. And there's that verbal accountability or calling their teammates up out of love because they're worthy of that high standard, but they're speaking up. You hear their voices, and they don't like. Are you okay with an athlete having a tantrum after they miss a 3-point shot? Are you okay with? And if they're not, what do you do about it?
right. That makes a ton of sense. So let's begin with a vision. When we are, and I think this is perfect timing for me, selfishly, because I'm beginning to build the vision and mission of, my freshman basketball team that I'm coaching. We're building a vision and a mission. How do we make sure that it comes from? I mean, coaches obviously have an influence on it, but I think one of the things that I've kind of recognized in my experience coaching is sometimes it's coach's team. This is our vision, and it's my way. You all are just getting on and being a part of it versus like, hey, look, coach is the guide, he is the captain, or she is driving us to where we want to go, but it's also a collective unit. So when we're building a vision and a mission, what does that look like?
Yeah, and I think you hit the nail on the head. And what worked, 3 and 4 years ago with athletes, I don't think it's resonating in 2023 like it was even 3 and 4 years ago. So, the vision and the values, it's activities like having the team come up with their values, and a list of values and when XYZ basketball team, when they're at their best, like what resonates with them, and when they're not, what's missing, kind of a thing. And so it's really asking the athletes to have some input into that.
That makes a ton of sense. And so when we're creating like a vision, I think everyone wants to win the championship, right? Like I think that's, to me, that's, a goal, right? But what is like how do we create like a vision with, like we're going to be a team that plays connected together. We're going to be a team that, works the hardest. Like, when it comes to like building that vision, how do we create it in a way that our team can control it? Because sometimes there's going to be experiences, and whether it be a bad game and we lose because we're just off that day. And does that mean we don't reach our vision, or what's that vision that we can really control within ourselves?
Yeah, the vision, I mean, that's tough, right? Because it has to resonate with each team and specific to their program, So examples are, like we've had teams, their vision was moonshot thinking, right? And, can a group of people come together and do something great? And I think it was President Kennedy who said we were going to put someone on the moon that decade, and we had no scientific reason to believe it, but he said it and they came together, and then it did in fact happen in that decade. But or a culture of love. But how do you create that vision? That's hard. I wish I could like communicate that into words that resonates with you or your people. But I think it has to be organic. It has to come from them. I think the biggest thing in 2023 is what we're hearing that's working is really seeking the input of the athletes more than we did even 3 and 4 years ago.
Yeah,
So
that
like
makes
you
it.
said, the coach just saying, here it is, is there buy-in to that, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
and can you talk about the importance of that buy-in and why that matters so much?
Yeah, because if there isn't buy-in, then you have some that aren't on the boat going in that direction. Or I used the analogy of like an Alaskan sled dog team. So what happened? And we actually had a couple of athletes on our team that were professional or not. One of them's, I think, almost professional, but Alaskan sled dog racers and doing the Iditarod. But what happens on a team when one dog is laying down? Or one is running in the opposite direction, or one's biting at the ankles of another dog. Like, is that team going to be as efficient in the race that matters most? So that's really culture. And yeah, so when there's not buy-in, uh, so I think you can win games in the regular season based on strategy and talent, but in the postseason, your culture is always revealed.
That's a good point. And I know that I don't know the exact values, but I know the Arizona Diamondbacks, are on this historic run. They're a team, they're a young team, and I'm not sure if you know the values of their coach, but it's something along the lines of like love, commitment, and trust, or I'm butchering one of them, and then I think there's one more. However, it's a team that like has like this, culture and this identity that is, bigger than, honestly, if you go and look at their lineup, on paper, right, it's not going to be one where anyone is even going to pick them to get to the playoffs. But because of that trust, that belief, can you talk about how, you may be able to, and they only won 84 games they're like one of the last teams to get into the postseason. However, now they're having a ton of success. So can you share a little bit more about how the love and the trust and the championship culture really helps teams play together in the postseason?
Yeah, and there are these special teams, like you described, the Arizona Diamondbacks, where the output of athlete one plus the output of athlete two is greater than three.
Hmm.
And so it's like the math doesn't even add up. But there are these special teams, like you're talking about the Arizona Diamondbacks, where there's just that synergy about them. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really cool to see, and I think what I feel like one of the questions that I would have as a high school coach, particularly, is sometimes we have talented players that may not buy into that culture. So, how have you faced that kind of question before in your own coaching experience or your consulting experience?
Yeah, and that's hard, and I can't pretend to have all of the answers, right? But I think
Right.
it's just like leaning into those hard conversations and why, what barriers do they have to getting on the same page with the team? What's holding them back? Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, having those tough conversations are important, and I can share something from yesterday. It wasn't necessarily like a super hard conversation. I just recognized that an athlete hadn't showed up. He hadn't been communicating with me, and he was there yesterday. He just was not engaged. So I was like, all right, I'm just gonna call him over, right? Like sometimes as coaches, we just like assume they're mad at us. And I work with younger athletes too, so it probably depends on the age and stage of the athletes we're working with. And I was just like, is everything okay? He didn't really open up too much to me. I was just like, I just want to check in and make sure you're okay. And he like gave me a hug. He's like, thanks, coach. Like
Oh,
just like even recognizing that I think I saw that something wasn't going right. Even though he didn't open up to me like what really was going on, I think just having someone in your corner that cares to make sure that you're doing okay as a person, right? Because I think I'd love to pivot and talk about the importance of for coaches to meet their players and connect with them as people before they're athletes. Can you talk about the importance of that?
yeah. Like they don't care how much we know until they know how much we care. So I tried to be about coaching the person first and then the athlete second. Yeah. So it's just like really getting to know them and love them, and what's their family like? When's their birthday? What are they
Yeah.
walking through right now? What's their hardest class? What's their favorite class?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's so important. And then with that, in your experience of coaching for 18 years, I'm sure you've got to watch a lot of your athletes grow up and get married and get jobs. Can you talk about that rewarding feeling and experience it's like as a coach to watch your players grow?
Yeah, I mean, that's really why we do it, right? Like my avenue was through the sport of gymnastics, and yours is through the sport of basketball, but that's really why we do it, just to be a part of their lives in those pretty important years, and to think that their experience on your team like continues to serve them in
Right.
decades to come.
Yeah, 100%. I think that's fascinating. And when it comes to one of the things I've heard is that the average coach will impact more people in a year than the average person will in a lifetime. And
Right.
I really think I believe that, but just because of our, opportunity and influence that we can have, and especially with young people. And when it comes to that and recognizing that just the importance of that position, what are some of your favorite memories from coaching high school gym or college gymnastics?
So many. I mean, some of the championships. We finished second in the country in 2019 and third in 2023. But some of the championships. But honestly, I have to say, like the funny stories. The dance parties on the bus and the blanket forts, and they'd come in and prank my office. So I've had like 400 balloons in my office, and uh, yarn that I couldn't even get to my computer because yarn was strung everywhere. And, so some of the funny stories, I'd say. But also, I can remember a time last year, Justin, where an athlete had fallen off the balance beam. And I heard her and saw her whisper, "I can do this." And that she was a freshman, but just she was really tough on herself to start the year, but to see that growth in her even in 1 year. Yeah, I think it's like those special moments.
Yeah, that is really cool, and I think those moments of teamwork and camaraderie. However, that last story you shared is actually a great point where I'd love to segue and have a conversation about is kind of the mental aspect, and I know that gymnastics. I think from what the little bit I know is like people who play or compete in gymnastics are probably some of the hardest people on themselves, right? So it's just because it's such a technical sport, you're getting judged and you have to get like tens, and it's there's just micro movements and you can get certain points docked. Can you talk about the importance of teaching our athletes how to kind of respond in productive ways versus being self-destructive, especially mentally, in what we say to ourselves?
Yeah, the self-talk is so much of it, right? The self-talk, and there's times in our life where we should talk to ourselves and not listen to ourselves. And I think and I could be getting his name wrong, but Dr. Gills, he runs a triathlon. I want to say he's in his 60s. I saw a newspaper article about it, but he runs a triathlon, and then he runs another, goes to sleep, gets up the next day and runs another triathlon. So, this newspaper article talks about if Dr. Gills were to think about how he feels and listen to himself, he would think, "I'm too old. I can't do this the next day. I'm too sore." Right. But if he talks to himself, he can say, like, one foot in front of another, and "I've got this," and like focus on the next mile, the next thing. Yeah.
Okay, so instead of like, because we all have those thoughts, right? Like in, bombarding, whether it's, we're playing sports or whether we're sitting on the couch and thinking about some sort of business thing or personal thing, right? Instead of listening to it, it's like talking to ourselves, like making sure, hey, one foot in front of the other. Or I feel like a lot of times my thoughts that come into mind, sometimes they're things that I cannot control, right? And so focusing on what we can control and controlling our standards as coaches and focusing on what we emphasize. Can you talk about how the standards that we we preach and we reemphasize and we celebrate really helps and shapes our culture.
Yeah, and the standards are everything, right? But I think it's really like, what are we okay with and what do we allow, right? So if an athlete comes late to practice and then does it again tomorrow and the next day and then starts in Friday night's game, right? What kind of standard did we just like set for our team? Right? So really out of love, I mean, my recommendation would be for that athlete not to start,
Right.
because then you've just raised the standard of your team. Yeah.
100%.
And also asking them. I mean, I think there's just been such a change in NCAA sports in the last couple of years with the student athlete voice and NIL and the transfer portal, but really leaning in to the athletes and asking them, what do they think? Do they think A is best for our team or B? And what we're hearing is when coaches do that, a team goes harder in a direction that the coach supports than if it was the coach demanding all of it, right?
Gotcha.
So
So,
average teams, the coaches are leading,
right.
right? But elite teams, those players are holding the standards.
And I
And
feel
so
like,
it's not asking the players what do they think should happen, and even having a packet of standards, but letting them vote on it. What do they think? What are 3 changes they'd make with these set of standards?
100%. And exactly what we talked about at the beginning, right? Giving them that voice, and whether it's A or B, it's just you have buy-in. You feel like it's more, you own part of it, right? Like if you were going to own a stock, right, or something, right? You feel more compelled. And I think one of the things is the challenging parts is making sure that we connect with all of our athletes, just not just the ones who play. For basketball, it's about 9 or 10 out of your maybe 12 to 15 who are on the roster. How do you make sure as a coach that you connect and have buy-in from everyone, and including the people who may not be on the mat or on the court?
Yeah. And I'd be lying if I said I always did, right? So I
Yeah,
didn't. Yeah.
yeah,
But I
yeah.
think it's like really valuing every role. And every role does have value, right? So who's the injured player that's standing under the hoop catching the balls during warm-ups at a game? Like, he matters. And if he's on his phone, right, and just like not fully present owning his role, or the person who's videotaping matters. So for me as a coach, at least I tried to just like recognize and thank those people,
Yeah, that makes a ton of
because if
sense.
if those if those players aren't doing their job, right, the person that's hitting 23 points in a game may not be able to do their job.
Right. And so for those that are practicing and working hard, like making sure that, you know, the others are, the game players are getting good quality reps, right? If they're not doing their job, they're not showing up, they're only giving 50% effort. It's not possible to reach our fullest potential. So we need everyone to kind of bring that and channel that energy. And like, that's how we become great.
Yeah. Yeah, and if someone isn't in a space to bring their full energy, I mean, maybe it's better for them to take a day,
Right.
and come back tomorrow when you feel like you can.
Yeah, that's a
Yeah.
good point. I think, when it comes to that and maybe kind of the newer wave, and how do we make sure as coaches we're checking in with their mental health? I think it's obviously it's an art to it, right? There's no like right science behind, you can take a day, or, you need to push through it, if there's a big game coming up. I guess, what's your philosophy on, kind of giving players rest days, especially, I guess we can deem them important players or players that compete on the mat, or, compete on the court.
Yeah, I used to say, like, okay, everybody gets one day off, personal day for whatever reason that they want. But then, even in recent years, last year said, well, what if you could benefit from? What if you need more than one? Then you should take that.
Right.
You should take that. But then when they're there, again, they're just going so hard in a direction that as a coach you'd support. Like, they're
Yeah.
fully there. So I'm a big believer in allowing that. And I think that you're going to get more effort and energy than if we don't allow for that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think one of the things I had on Joanne McCallie, she coached at Duke University basketball. What she would say is like, make sure you can give them their mental health days, but also check in with them and make sure that they're taking care of themselves. Are they eating enough food? Are they, making sure that they're doing their homework, right? Or are they falling behind in their stress? Are they sleeping enough? So checking in with them just about how they're doing, what they're doing in their personal life, right? And making sure that they,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, we're kind of teachers, right? Teachers of life, and teaching them how to, balance. And, obviously, you have to prioritize your sport when it's in season, and college sports, it's like that's like a full-time job, right? So it's a lot of work between being a collegiate gymnast and also being a student. So it's kind of that art, but that's the life lessons and the teachings of all of it.
Yeah. My former coach, Julie Castellano, she did things like, are we above the line or below the line
Mm,
today? Or like, how are we feeling? Right. And then check in with a partner and in small groups talk about that. But, just for as a coach to be able to kind of eyeball that and then check in with a couple of athletes, we'd even ask, how many hours of sleep did you get last night? And modify workouts based on that. Because when we were really in tune with them, then we're going to be healthier and less injured than if we're just sending, every workout at a 10. Those were the years that we were more injured, unfortunately.
right. I know it's
Yeah.
such an art, right? To like, we want to have this practice plan. We always want to be going 80 to 100%. However, I feel like, that's not listening to, where our athletes are at. And so can you talk about how you probably shifted, right? From the beginning, maybe beginning of your coaching, when you're like, we're always going to go hard, to like, kind of moving and meeting. And can you talk about how you almost have to like let go a little bit of your coach and ego and expectations, because it feels
Yeah.
like you feel like you're not doing enough. However, I think it's more sustainable in the long run.
Yeah, definitely as a younger coach, I would say just, going at a 10 all the time. And, uh, yeah, I don't think I knew enough to like ask questions and to listen and check in on how they were doing. But even, if you go hard Monday, Tuesday, then Wednesday should really be recovery type of day.
Right.
So knowing and understanding that much better definitely kept us healthier.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it is super important, right? Injury prevention is huge, and especially for athletes. Even I feel like I've come to the high school age stage because they're playing sports all year round. I'm not sure if club gymnastics is a thing. If they're competing all year round, you're like, yep,
Yeah.
yep. So I mean, that's a lot of stress on tendons, joints, ligaments that are still growing and developing. And I have training programs, so I know that I'm trying to figure out certain ways of it's great to play multiple sports. So maybe on a Saturday, instead of, I'm thinking maybe more off season, you're playing, if your sport is basketball, playing some flag football, you're still getting some movement in, but you're changing the certain ligaments and muscles that are getting worked all the time. And so, can you talk about how you made sure and you designed into your program like injury prevention and longevity?
Yeah. And I never understood, like, why did we wait until an athlete was injured and then we go see the athletic trainer,
Right.
right? When what kinds of preventative things can we do, like preventative ankle therapy and balancing on one leg with our eyes closed and um, proper landing technique, our knees pointing out over our second toe when we land, our feet shoulder width apart, those kind of things. But yet, just even the progression of the week too. So, like again, if you go hard Monday, Tuesday, that then Wednesday is recovery. And I used to think it was rest, but it's really like the blood flow through the muscles at a 5 pace, a 20-minute bike or swim kind of a thing. And you're not going at an 8 or a 10, you're going at a 5. And
Right.
that's like the best way to recover. Now, I wouldn't say that's necessarily my area of expertise. It's more the culture, but still happy to share some of the things that I've learned or mistakes that I made early on.
Yeah, it's an important part of the culture, right? To not burn our players out, and I think that is a really important part of it. Is instead and having active recovery and movement, especially for our athletes who, especially for the high school ones who sit at, they're sitting in chairs probably what 4 to 6 hours a day, depending on periods, and I mean even for college athletes, they're sitting in at desks and working, and we have to move and get that blood flow, which is really important. So kind of getting back is shifting back to our, kind of last, what would you say, what's the end of like a meet for gymnastics? Is it like, it's not the fourth quarter, it's like, is there like a
It's
last
just the
stage?
last event, the fourth event.
All right, so we're moving into the fourth event for our
Yeah.
podcast conversation, and I think where do you see kind of teams having the biggest area of growth and need for growth when it comes to building their team culture?
That's a good question. I think it's so specific to the team, but the commonalities, I'll tell
Yeah.
you, the teams I've worked with recently, is the need for that verbal leadership and verbal accountability amongst the athletes is a big area for growth. So, I support things like the athletes leading a couple of practices.
Mm.
And I've called them silent but supportive practices, where, you task a couple of the athletes with coming up with the practice plan and then speaking up and leading it and holding their own teammates to that high standard. The coaches are on the side and they're silent and supportive, and they can, cheer or answer questions. But it's trying to give them spaces so that the athletes are holding the high standards. That, or like leadership development. I like Jeff Jansen's books myself, and the captain's manual. So going through that with either the whole team or a set designated leaders a couple times a month. I'd say that's probably the biggest missing component of some of these teams.
Yeah, it makes a ton of sense. And I see that too, especially at the varsity level. As players get more talented, I feel like almost the leadership void sometimes it becomes more apparent, so to speak. And so, you shared a couple of good ideas. And so for me and the other coaches that are listening, even the parents that want to help and start developing leaders, like, you talked about the importance of maybe having them lead a practice, right? Or it could be leading a drill, kind of starting smaller. Can you share other different ideas on how do we, number one, recognize maybe some of more of our verbal leaders, and then, develop and nurture their abilities?
Yeah, and I think some of it too, like you said, Justin, is like telling stories about teams that have held each other accountable, right? So we've had a team where it was Kelly Huseman and Kaylee Johndal were their names, but we hit something like 4 out of 6 of our show routines together at one time, right? And maybe this would be, I don't know what the comparison would be in basketball. Maybe you can help translate that, but it wasn't very great. But right afterwards, one of them, Kaylee, said, "We're doing that again, and that's not to our standard. So we're doing it again from the top." And as the coach, my mouth just hit the floor, and I'm like, "What? I mean, you heard her. Okay, we're doing it again, right?" Or another example is we have a dry season, so the athletes don't drink alcohol January through March. And one year, one of the freshmen went out and drank, and I didn't hear about it yet. But a couple of the leaders, they texted the whole team, had them all come in at 6:15 on a Saturday morning. They did sprints, and they said, "Okay, now this is done and dealt with, and we're not going to talk about it anymore, and it's not going to happen again." And so I found out about it 2 weeks later, and again, I'm like, "Oh my gosh!" Right? So I think even sharing some of those stories of when that happened, and just like what a special thing it is to be a part of a team like that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
huge. And my initial question is like, did you have those conversations with, the certain seniors or team leaders that held them accountable, like prior, like if something was going to happen? Or do you think these, certain athletes that you had on your team were just like quote unquote special, or because that's like a really cool story where they're holding each other accountable and they're not even getting coach involved.
Yeah, I'd say both. I mean, in the years where we didn't necessarily have that internal leadership, I'd always ask myself, like, what can I do differently or better to help them learn to lead, right? So, I mean, I took that on my own shoulders, but I think it was both. I think that they were some special young women who stepped up and did that, along with, having like a packet of standards that the team comes up with and agrees on. And, these twice a month kind of leadership meetings.
And for those leadership meetings, would they happen like in a classroom, or did they happen like, after a practice on a mat? Like when did because I know that that's the challenge, I think, especially, and I'm sure it's in gymnastics, but like, with basketball, sometimes they're like, oh, we have to do this, this, and this, it's going to take away from our X's and O's time because there's only so much time in a day. You only have so much time you can meet with the team, especially if you're a high school team. However, it's also building the culture, like we've kind of talked about this whole episode, it's actually leads to winning, which is what our goals are.
Right.
Can you talk about how you prioritize that and where and when you do those?
Yeah, we did just do it after a practice, on a mat, in the classroom, in the bleachers. Yeah, I mean, even 30 minutes kind of a thing. I think it's worth investing in. So if you shorten practice by a half hour to do it, and for them, there's so many of them that are, physical therapists and occupational therapists and these, boss women that are killing it in sales. And they talked about that, some of these leadership skills that they learned help them become these amazing managers later. So, it's really an investment in them is hopefully how, your athletes can see it.
Absolutely. And so for those leadership kind of, workshops and exercises, can you give a couple of examples of what some of those workshops dived in on?
Yeah, like I said, we used Jeff Jansen's captain's leadership manual. So there's some really great things in there. Let me think if I can think of a specific example. A lot of times we just like reflect on where athletes were and even the whole team and how to help each one of them like move along or show up for them. And then we'd break it down like, okay, now who is going to connect with her and who's going to, if they're resistant or reluctant, and they're not committed or compelled yet, right? It's just like who's going to connect with them and follow up.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like probably just, kind of continuing to reiterate. So if you do like a development session and then kind of, reiterating that point in the next practice session, we talked about commitment and then celebrating a certain athlete that demonstrates that. And so, continuing to develop on it and help them, kind of reflect. I think that's a big one that I'm, really believe in as well, is like if we can give our athletes a skill and tool to become more self-aware versus like always having coach tell them, oh, you did well at this or you improved at this, like getting them to kind of start thinking for themselves.
Yeah. And just asking the question. That's what I think athletes right now, yeah, like ask the questions for them to find their own right answers.
Absolutely. So my final question for you is, when we're building championship team cultures for the coaches and even the parents that are listening, what would be the number one takeaway you would want them to come away with from this conversation?
That's a good question. And you'd say for the coaches?
Coaches and yeah, we can go coaches and even for the parents that are trying to be proactive if their kids happen to listen to them at this time.
Yeah. There's a lot, but I would say, just really showing up for the, like having high standards of behavior. And when that doesn't happen, what do you do about it? Right?
100%. Yeah, having that
So there
accountability.
should be some sort of like accountability,
And
in
then
my opinion. And again, it's out of love.
yeah. And so
But
for
is it that the athlete doesn't play? Is it asking the athletes, do they think A is best for our team or B?
yeah, so having
Yeah.
accountability options and then maybe having a team, kind of vote on it or kind of getting a gauge for it. However, like this is what we agreed to instead of having, kind of what we talked about, coach rules, this, then that. However, there needs to be some standards, and accountability for what happens because, what happens when you show up late for a job interview, you may not get the job, right? So these are such important skills that we're teaching.
And I think so often as coaches, we make the decision based on like what's best to win that game that week versus that might hurt your team's culture over the course of the season and hurt you when it matters most. Right. So if we can step back and make the decision, the hard decision of what's best for your team in the long term, I think that's where our best teams and our best cultures and best selves lie.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, always making that sure that the decision aligns with our vision and values and our long-term development for our athletes. I believe that's what's most important. So where can people, find and connect with you if they want to learn more?
Yeah, so the website is www.championshipculturecoach.com or via email, Becky@championshipculturecoach.com.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for your time today, Becky. I really enjoyed our conversation. I am now out of pages of notes in this notebook. All right. And thank you so much.
Thanks, Justin.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Bridging Impact Podcast. We'd love it if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment and a review on whatever platform you're on. It's the best way to help us grow. We appreciate you for doing that. We'll shout you out on social media. I'd also love if you connected with me on social media. Let me know your thoughts. And this is why I do it. I want to share knowledge and wisdom from experienced leaders to people like yourself and myself so we can have this dialogue and move forward, make an impact on the world. So stay tuned, stay subscribed. Cheers.